Thank you all for being here for the festival, for this second last session, where it's one of the rare sessions in this festival where we are actually talking about books, craft, and technique. And And we have a very wonderful panel here. All of them are friends. It's a pleasure, it's a privilege to be with Amit Chaudhuri, Tahmima ma'am, Sarvat Hasin, and Kunal, all accomplished novelists who I've admired over the years, some more recently because they've only just written their recent novel. And we are talking today about shaping the novel. I'm going to read from my notes because it's a bit scattered, and this is about structure, so it better be structured. The story is older than the novel, and narrative structure changes with traditions, with available tools and techniques, and with the attention span of audiences, which changes in different societies and situations. In India and in much of South Asia, the ancient epic of the Mahabharata and the folk model of the Katha Sarit Sagar, or the Sea of Stories, have remained the font and the template of our stories across centuries. Stories are cast into those sort of molds, and many modern novels do, in fact, model themselves on the Mahabharata. The great serial novels of Dickens, Dostoevsky, and others, appearing in weekly or monthly installments, had what was a classic episodic structure, which was also mirrored in the first Hindi novel, which was called Chandrakanta, and which came out in erratic installments because the writer was on the run from the British police, in fact. And then there's the work of path-breaking Bangla novelists, which has always appeared in these great periodicals like Desh and Jugantar. Structure is not synonymous with plot. It has to do with the pacing, with the timing, with the patterns that give coherence and shape to the story. Successful novels usually have a shape in the mind of their authors, which defines and differentiates the key stages in the movement. This could be a very simple linear model, which is the three-act concept, for which my last novel and her novel both had that, and we had the same editor. So obviously, she believed in the three-act concept. Then there are parallel narratives. There's the backward glance, or more adventurous and individual styles. Kurt Vonnegut wrote a thesis for an anthropology degree, which juxtaposed the shape of the narratives with the social history of those times. And if we get time later, I'll show you that very funny clip from his talk on this. He said, to quote, "The fundamental idea is that stories have shapes, which can be drawn on a graph paper, and that the shape of a given society's stories is at least as interesting as the shape of its pots or the spearheads." His thesis was rejected. But the plot categories are fascinating and very predictable. There's boy meets girl, there's man in a hole, there's bad to worse, and the all-time favorite is Cinderella. I'm going to ask a question to all the four speakers here. Do you see a shape? Do you see a structure? Do you see a silhouette of your book from the very start? I know that I do. I know this is going to be a wavy book or a straight book, or they're more usually wavy than straight for me. But do you approach the process of writing like a block of marble within which you'll carve out your story? Or is it a mold which you have already made into which you cast your story? I mean, how do you think of the shape of your story when you begin? All of you, whichever wants to tell me first.
Can you all hear me? You know, once, interesting question. Once Mozart said, I could see the symphony in the blink of an eye. Now, how do you see a symphony in the blink of an eye? You could probably hear it. So, speaking for myself, I actually see flashes of the novel. The lights, the colors, the faces, the locations, and a kind of meandering narrative or story that sort of combines all of that. Okay? And if that's attractive, sometimes it's not, and it goes into the waste paper basket. But if it seems interesting to me, and then it sort of lends itself to more careful scrutiny, and all the stuff that the boring stuff that we do as writers, think about structure, we think about characterization and things like that. But the fundamental starting point for me is that glimpse.
So it's like a jhalak, a little, yeah. Not a shape.
Well, What is a shape and what is a...
It's all right. I mean, we got it. You got the symphony, the blink of a...
Right.
I think Amit, the most learned of us all.
What do I see? Or
when you plan a novel, or when you begin a novel, do you already know the shape of it, which is different from the structure of it? Like, I know the shape of your latest novel, which I've read very carefully, Friend of My Youth. And I won't presume to tell you what I think the shape is, but I'd love to know how, when you proceed, you already got to time it. When you got to time it, you have to know the timeline, the structure is going to be, where the movements and the breaks are going to be.
When I wrote my first novel, the basic idea was, I'm going to write a novel about a holiday. Okay, so a holiday means a change of locale or place, and that change of location, in which things which are familiar are rendered unfamiliar because he's in slightly alien territory, but he's also in a time span in which nothing much is happening, because this is a holiday in a cousin's house. So it's not a holiday where one goes off to see monuments or go sightseeing. He's just gone to a street at a cousin's house. So just that, for me, was to stand, the emotional charge of the change of location was for me to take place of the story. Yes. So it never occurred to me that how do I write about a holiday without writing a story? How is a holiday or a change of location or an interruption in one's life, how does that constitute a story? But for me, that's what it did. That interruption was, for me, of interest, and it continued to be of interest. So that interruption in time,
yes,
where nothing is happening, but meanings and significances are altered because he's in a different location. There were other impulses as well. I knew that I was writing about something based on my childhood, but I did not want to write it as a memory of childhood.
Yes.
I wanted to write it as an experience of the now. And so this experience of the moment, of living in the moment, was to me far more important than somehow trying to render this experience of recounting the past.
I got that.
So I didn't want to recount the past, I wanted to render this experience of being alive in the present moment. In connection with Friend of My Youth, something that applies also to most of my novels is that I'm not sure at which point the act of writing begins. But I won't say that the act of writing the novel begins with the word put down on the page.
Of course not.
The act of writing begins at some point.
Yes.
One is aware of it having begun.
Yes.
Something happens, especially to someone like me who wants to write about life, but at the same time wants to write about the act of writing about life. So, for me, there is a moment at which, and I say this in Friend of My Youth, where living and writing will converge. I'm living, the act of writing has begun. There's a particular moment at which that occurs. So this has happened with most of my novels, that I'm in the midst of something and then I'm aware that a process has begun.
That's very tellingly described, and I think all writers,
Was it learned enough?
That we have to ask the audience. Vote up. Was it learned enough? Yeah, they're all very learned. That's why they're for a literary session instead of a musical session. Yeah, Tahmima, what do you feel?
I've been tutoring, mentoring a student of writing, and she asked me, do I have to know exactly what's going to happen? Do I have to know the shape of the novel before I write it? And I said, no, you don't. But if it's going to come to you in the process of writing, then you may have to go back. You always inherit the way that you started. So if you start with a shape or you start with a very clear sense of what's happening, you may have to work harder to bring in the element of surprise, or that sort of sense of newness that you might get if you just forge ahead and you don't know exactly where you're going.
Thank you.
Whereas if if you don't know where you're going, you may inherit the slight trickiness of going back and imposing a structure where there isn't one. So it's like putting a skeleton back into a body.
Yes.
Without, so I think in terms of shaping, I think those are, I mean, obviously there are many ways of doing things, but those are two very different ways of doing things. One is you have an outline, you know exactly where it's going, you know that it's going to be in 3 acts, or you know that there's going to be, a point of view change in the middle or something like that. And I think you lose something there, which is you lose that element of freshness, or that element of surprise, because things might feel a bit schematic or plotted. On the other hand, you may not have to go back and do as many edits, and we all know that the magic happens in the editing. It doesn't happen in the writing.
That's true. What about you, Sarvat? Youngest?
So I actually started. Can everyone hear me?
Just
about, right.
Talk louder.
So I actually started writing my novel on a creative writing course. And when I was pitching the idea for this book to my tutor, one of the things they needed was a synopsis and a chapter outline. And I'd never written a chapter outline before. Before doing that, my approach to writing was to just sort of like chase the beast. Like wherever the story was going to go, I was going to go. And I was quite happy to follow thoughts. And that meant that I ended up with a lot of unfinished manuscripts and a lot of ideas that never actually developed into full stories. And with this novel, because I had a chapter outline, no matter how much it changed from that idea, that initial jhalak, that idea that it was in my head, no matter how much it changed, I still had this roadmap to go back to every time the writing was difficult, or every time it didn't feel like it was ever going to finish, because novels take a very long time to write. I had something to turn to, which was very, very useful.
Something like an anchor or a lifeline.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
You didn't feel tied down by that.
I
didn't
didn't
feel like, oh, I want to change that, or it's not quite working.
It did change quite a lot in the process, but I think that happens regardless of whether you have a structure or not. I think when you're writing, for me at least, it's very important to remember that you're not writing the book that exists in your head. You're writing something completely different. And then when you're finished and you go back and you're going through the editing process, you're trying to make the book on the page as close to the ideal in your head as possible. And it'll never quite get there. I don't think, for me, they'll ever quite meet, but that's what the editing process is for.
So I'm going to ask Tahmima a question or two. The first question is that Camilla Shamsi said of A Golden Age that throughout the story, Anam deftly balances the story of nation against that of family. There is never a moment when we lose sight of the upheaval of Dhaka in 1971, but she adroitly weaves these stories into the personal lives of her characters. So how did you, through these books, through the trilogy, maintain this very fine balance between the larger story and the inner story that populated it?
So my first novel was was set during the Bangladesh War of Independence in 1971. And in a way it was the easiest novel to write, because having a historical moment that overrides everything and that sort of both casts a shadow and illuminates from within the characters' lives is something that gives the novel a shape. So it started at the beginning of war, and it ended, well, it didn't, I mean, it started a bit before that, but essentially it took place in the 9 months of that war, and the war, it was a historical moment. It had a beginning, a middle, and an end, and that gave me something on which to hang the story. But I did initially think that I was going to write a big war novel with lots of scenes of battle and, you know, all that kind of masculine stuff. And then I ended up writing the story of a family. And in fact, the novel was about a widow, and she was watching her children go off into this war. And having that perspective of a woman who's not quite in the middle of the action, she's not the one who's standing on the street and shouting the slogans, that really helped. So I suppose it was a way for me to write about that moment without feeling like it was going to take over, that the characters themselves would be at the center of the story. And that's why it took place in this
So
home.
her detachment was the device, just like his moving to a holiday was that stepping
Yes.
back.
Yes.
Nice. Learning a lot. And there's the next question here, is that now to go into how you write. You were born in Dhaka, you grew up in Paris, New York, Bangkok, live in London, and yet your work, as indeed discovered your PhD thesis, has been focused on the geopolitical fractures of the war and the liberation of Bangladesh. So between Golden Age, the Good Muslim, and the Bones of Grace, you draw an arc across the recent history of South Asia. Though South Asia, people are getting irritated with that word these days, but with India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. So how have you shaped language and narrative style to the geography of these three books? Did the shape of your third novel in particular, and all the three, but Bones of Grace, but partly set in America, change with this relocation to America? And could you give us a reading from the novella embedded in the novel, in the book? Maybe a little reading to give us a sense of how you shifted the landscape and the language, or the approach, or something that the window with the relocation.
So my third novel, so I wrote a trilogy set in Bangladesh. So the first one began with Bangladesh, and this one ends with, it's sort of set in contemporary times. This was the hardest one to write because the present doesn't have a shape, because it doesn't have an end. It's in the moment, and so I had to decide what the themes of this book were. I couldn't reach back into the past and say, well, in the 70s we were talking about freedom and its consequences and its costs, and maybe in the 80s we were talking about religion and what role that would play in the nation. And obviously the present is much more complex. You can choose any number of things to focus on. So I wrote the story of a young woman who lives with parents who are revolutionaries, much like myself, and she feels envious of them because they have a moral purpose, and she feels that this moral purpose is lacking in her life, and she's also looking for her biological parents. She's adopted, and in the middle of this book is a novella, and the novella is a story that's told to her by a construction worker. And you don't find out until the end how she and this man are related to each other. I'm going to just read, but I'm not going to read to you from the novella.
Read where you feel like, just to give us a sense.
I was just going to read the setup.
Okay.
If I can find it.
We'll hold on. We'll all take a deep breath and think of our own unfinished manuscripts lying in various drawers.
Or you
How
can
many
think
people in the audience have a manuscript lying somewhere? Yeah. Well, the rest of you get started now.
Sorry. It's that thing where you write a book and then suddenly it becomes distant. It becomes something else. Okay. So the man's name is Anwar. This is how Anwar jolted himself into my life, by accosting me on the street and insisting I was someone else. I quickly forgot the woman's name. He called me Meghna. Nothing to me, right? Nothing, but everything. But that's for later. Don't blame me for parsing out the story slowly, Elijah. These things take time, and I seem to have all the time in the world, because you never appear at the traffic lights anymore. I've sometimes waited at the coffee shop across the street, reading Anna Karenina and looking up every few minutes to see if I've conjured you, but there's no trace of you there or anywhere else in this cold, cold city. You are about to arrive on the beach, and the very best and the very worst things are about to happen. These memories, if you choose to linger on them, will be the ones that pain you most, the ones that will make you want to stop, burn this letter, and never think of me again. So before you read on, read this first. Another story, a love story, another quest, that of Anwar, a man who both rejected and accepted his fate, a man who protested silently for his whole life against the many injustices the world had decided to mete out to him. Read him gently, dear Elijah. Let your gaze on this page soften. Remember that he had nothing to do with my treatment of you, so regard him with kindness and judge him like the innocent he is. So I suppose the reason I want to read this is because I had to do some work in stitching this piece into the novel. And the way that I did that was by her kind of setting it up and explaining a little bit why she did it and how he, and by extension the reader, should look upon this little interlude.
Thank you. That was extremely illuminating. I'm going to move to Kunal Basu. Kunal, I reviewed your very first book, as I remember, Your books come in very different shapes, sizes, categories, in a way, different continents, different places. Novels in English include Opium Clerk, The Miniaturist, Racists, The Yellow Emperor, and Calcutta. And they are the two Bangla novels now. He's bilingual, and he's begun the movement to write in Bengali again. So I want to talk about your latest novel, Calcutta, which looks at the joy and sorrow through the eyes of an outsider, a Muslim migrant from Bihar who moves back to India from Bangladesh. In a review, Annie Zaidi commented, "The plot is dense with movement, and each character represents some aspect of Calcutta and the life of its citizens, rich, middle class, and poor." The cover, which won the Oxford Bookstore cover for the book prize, show to them, shows a werewolf type of metamorphosis in process, which to my mind followed in some ways the contours of the story. Would you say in some way the structure of the novel mirrors, reflects the very brutal, the very dense, the very overpopulated shape and texture of life in Calcutta? And how did your perception of that city resonate with the way you structured the narrative? Also, there's been a criticism that you structured it a bit too much. Tell us about how you molded your novel into a city, or a city into your novel.
Well, you see, Calcutta is the story of a gigolo, a male prostitute. Now, I don't know about you, Namita, but before I started writing this novel, I'd never met a gigolo in my life.
I haven't. I'd love to, maybe soon, tonight. Yeah.
Right. In fact, I didn't know that whether such a creature at all existed in the city that I was born and raised in. Of course, I was obviously very aware of the substantial underclass that exists in Kolkata, but I'd never had the occasion to really smell their sweat, as it were. Yeah. Now, the writing of this novel actually took me far out of my comfort zone. When I thought of this
Why were you smelling his sweat?
Metaphorically.
Okay.
Not literally.
Okay, got it.
Yeah,
Getting
Writers, we're writers.
like we get under the skin of our characters.
Okay, got it.
But you see, you talk about perceptions.
Yeah.
The very names, the different names of the city reflect the different dominant perceptions. I mean, the British call it Calcutta, which is a world of the upper class, the anglicized, people who send their children to English medium schools. Now, Kolkata is the name which is used by the Bengali middle class, the genteel Bhadralok, the intelligentsia. And Calcutta is the name which is used by the dispossessed, people who are fleeing famines, wars, riots, and they've made their Calcutta their home. So this novel was not really about my city, the city that I grew up in, which is the Bengali middle class Kolkata, but it's really about the other city. And writing this novel, as I said, really took me out of my comfort zone because I needed to actually invade and intrude into that world to understand the shape of their dreams, the shape of their perceptions, their views, their attitudes, their prejudices, their angers, their loves, their lusts with respect to Calcutta. So I spent close to 2 years in the world of immigrants, Bihar immigrants from Bangladesh, who sort of populate the famous or infamous Geneva camp in Dhaka, and who come into Kolkata from time to time. And my story is about this young boy who comes to Kolkata as a child and grows up, but sort of loses his way and becomes a masseur, becomes a worker in a massage parlor. So for 2 years, I frequented the world of massage parlors, of drug dealers, of people who forge passports for a living, the world of transgenders, and of course the world of gigolos. Okay.
So did you structure it along the linear line of these lives, or the many, just give me how you saw the shape. I'm really genuinely curious because it's such a spread out novel.
Yeah. So it starts out in this huge household called number 14 Zakaria Street with many different kinds of characters. Okay. And each has a story to tell. And they're all trying to desperately to belong. You know, to many people in the world, Calcutta is the Manhattan, is the New York, is a fabled melting pot, where people can come and lose their individual identities and become Calcuttawalas. Okay, and so that's the structure of the novel is very much in sort of.
So would you call it a house with many rooms kind of a structure?
House with many rooms, and then we focus in on. I focus in into one room, which is the household of Jamshed Alam of Jami. Okay, and then follow his story. Then on, not really linearly, but going sort of fluctuating between his world, his many worlds, and the world that he has come from.
Well, I know that you've begun writing screen scripts now.
Yeah.
Would you say there was a cinematic look at it, or how would you?
I think I'm a failed artist, so there's a dimension of imagery in almost all my writing.
And that is true. There's the miniaturist, there's...
Yes. Did I see it as cinema? I didn't consciously write it for cinema, but I think I have to see the events unfold in my mind's eye before I can put pen to paper. So in that respect, it could be cinematic, could be viewed as cinematic.
My next question is to you, but strangely enough, it will spread also to the other two by contagion, because all across India, as they say, or all across South Asia, they say, what do they say? One Bengali, the poet, two Bengalis is a poetry magazine, and three Bengalis is a revolution. Is that what they say?
Three Bengalis.
What is three Bengalis? An anthology?
Like a small gymkhana, maybe.
So the thing
sports
is,
club.
just quite by coincidence, Tahmima is from Bangladesh, and they are scattered around the world, but the strong, Bangla is the sixth most spoken language in the world, and I'd say it's the one with one of the greatest literary traditions within it. From the outside, I'm saying, with a certain amount of detachment, as you would say. But when you started writing in Bengali or Bangla, did the structure, as I said, it was earlier episodic, it's adventurous, it's contemporary, but did the Bangla impact how you wrote your Bangla novels? Did you write them the same way as you wrote English, or did you write them differently?
Yeah, this is a question for which I don't have the full answer, Namita, because I've always thought of myself as bilingual. I've always waved this flag around the world saying that Bengalis are perhaps the most bilingual tribe on earth. That indeed, for us, the two languages, Bangla and English, are like two intermingling streams. And we can shift from one stream to the other without abandoning one. And so, in terms of methodology, in terms of how I view my writing, there was not a seismic shift between my English novels and the two Bengali novels that I've written. But in what ways the language influenced the way they've turned out is something that I'm yet to come to grips with.
So keen to know about it another time. How the subtext of the language, how it impacted the sensibility, even the sounds of words or the rhythm of...
Yes.
You wanted to talk about
question. Did it affect tense? Because in Bangla, you would more naturally possibly write in the present tense because of the way the language is structured.
Mm-hmm. The two novels in Bangla are set in present times and the sort of running narrative, as it were. Yeah. So it actually helped me in sort of using my colloquial Bengali to sort of write in that way.
So before coming to Amit, I'll just go to Sarvat first. I must confess I have a bias that recently I read a lot, and I have a very terrible way of reading, which is I read the beginning, I read the end, and then I read the middle. And it just becomes automatic, because if you've got too much reading to do, that's the best way to get it in. But when I began her book, which had come to me for a blurb, I read it from the beginning to the end. So obviously she'd got something right, and I wanted to know what happened next. It's a very powerfully structured novel. It follows, as we said, Sarvat, your debut novel, This Wide Night, follows the classic three-act structure. This haunting siren song, it's got the sound of the sea in it, this book. And it's one level about femininity, which is quite literally drowning in itself. Or maybe I'm being a bit too poetic, but that's what I felt. And the waves, the ocean, the island, even the island is almost a structure within it. So tell us a little about how the novel has been fashioned and the approach and the process. You already told us a bit, but take it further about the... I forgot to ask you if you want to read a passage. I'm sorry.
No.
But
no,
we can
that's
go
all right.
back
We
to
can
that
come
a
back
little
to it.
later.
So I was talking earlier about structuring the novel, and now I'm going to talk a little bit about the sort of like other side of it, the feelings and things that shaped it. And what Amit was saying earlier about the act of writing and where it begins, I think for This White Night I have a very clear idea of where it began, and that was with the image of being on the coast of Manora. So Manora I describe in the book as an island off the coast of Karachi. It's actually technically a peninsula, but that sounded less romantic. So it's an island for the purposes of the book. And it's very different from the sea view and the seafronts in Karachi, which are incredibly bustling and incredibly cluttered, and they have this sort of pulsing feeling towards them as if the entire city is just driving off towards the end of the world. Whereas in Manora, everything is incredibly quiet. It's different even from a private beach where you would have, you know, lots of children and lots of things running around. It's incredibly secluded, and it has this real, not necessarily a lack of energy, but it feels completely different from, if you've grown up in Karachi, you go there and it feels completely different. And I was taken there as a teenager by a friend whose father was in the Navy, and that image sort of shaped the beginning of the book, but it also shaped the entire novel, this idea of the sea. Because if you grow up in Karachi, the sea dominates the landscape so much, even though it's an incredibly sprawling city, and there are so many parts of the city that are so far away from it, everything's hurtling towards that direction.
Hurtling is right in
Yeah.
that book, really. Do you want to read a small passage from it? And before that, I also wanted to ask you one more question about, there's another template or another sort of story within the story of this book, which is about one of my favorite novels, the American novel by Louisa May Alcott called Little Women. And suddenly in Karachi you find Little Women, you know. And you see how you've used that book to structure this one. How did you do that? That's quite a feat, you know, the way you stitched it in.
So Little Women was never meant to be more than a jumping off point. So I definitely borrow the structure of the family and the four sisters and this sort of matriarchy that they're growing up in with the absent father and the...
And
strong
even
mother.
I think Meg and Beth and
Yeah,
something. I mean,
definitely.
the
A lot of the character structures are borrowed from it, but it's also the idea that Little Women was one of the very few books that I read when I was younger that talked about young girls in a way where they were aspiring to something other than romance and marriage. So the girls in Little Women are encouraged to be very hardworking. There's a lot of emphasis placed on education. There's a lot of emphasis placed on, you know, having a very strong work ethic and their charitable efforts and their efforts towards war. They're allowed to be, even though some of the sisters in the book do get married and they do have relationships, that's not the driving force of the novel. The driving force of the novel is their relationships with each other and their work outside of that. So it was always going to be incredibly influential to me. And also Jo, I think anyone who has read Little Women and wanted to be a writer when they were younger, Jo is such an incredible character, and she's such a template for what you imagine a writer would be. So it was always an influence, but I also wanted to take a lot of the ideas in Little Women and turn them up a notch. So I've obviously read the book many times and, you know, watched the movie of Little Women a lot as well. And there are definitely things about it that you find, as you grow older, incredibly disconcerting. It's a very neat story, and even though it's a beautiful book, you sort of get to the end of it and you think that Louisa May Alcott has almost not, you know, resolved a lot, because characters, if they're proper human beings, they're flesh and blood human beings, things don't resolve that neatly. No one can be married to the person who asked to marry their sister and they're all sort of sitting around having like a very jolly Christmas dinner. It's not, in real life, things don't work out that way. So I wanted to explore a lot of the messiness that Louisa May Alcott doesn't quite touch upon.
Because when I saw the structure of this novel, of all these books, I saw it quite clearly. I saw these 3 acts, and then I saw a quarter, 4, like a quadrant. 1, 2, 3, 4, the stories of the sisters within that. I mean, I'm sure you didn't see it like that, but would you like to read a very short passage to give the audience a sense of your book?
Yes, I will read a couple of pages from the prologue of the book. Some strange things were happening in the house. Outside, the tides were rising, and the city seemed even further away. Those days, I was the only one who left the island. I brought back cigars for the captain and presents for my wife and her sisters, but they sat untouched. Books and lipsticks and bangles wrapped in gold foil. Just as the dresser in our bedroom was cluttered with paint instead of makeup, still boxed up from when we packed them back in Paris. The easel, bound in brown paper and string, rested against the door of our bathroom. I saw the soft ghost of it in the morning every morning when I shaved. Objects in this house had a peculiar stillness to them. Things brought back last week felt as if they'd been left here for 100 years. Flowers rotted in their vases. Fruit stank up the kitchen. The captain, in his lonely room down the corridor from us, had stopped making full sentences a few weeks ago. Communication was carried out through a series of hand gestures and mumbled words. He stayed in his room most of the time with a small bell at his elbow. The leather-backed armchair he sat in came from their old house in Karachi. He had not looked so small in it then. Now, the imposing breadth of it swallowed his shoulders, his thin face and hollowed-out eyes. Now, the dull bronze clack of the bell in the middle of the night, followed by the scurrying footsteps of a manservant to help him walk. In the evenings, when I got back home from work, I would sit with him. Together, we read Munto and Hemingway.
I think people are feeling.
We worked our way through the poorly assembled shelves. I probably took more comfort in this exercise than he did. He picked up the book with the end of his cane, and I read, turning the pages slowly while his unblinking eyes watched my lips. He never asked me for anything, even a hand to go to the bathroom. He chose to wait till I left the room, the quiet indignity of his helplessness, trailing me like a stray dog. And so it continued, small chinks in our long chain of days.
Thank you. I think we get a clap for that reading. And now we move to Amit, who I've saved for the last, so I can ask you an extra question. Your mastery of nuance and style, as well as your stubborn adherence to the quotidian, to the daily, to the certain unities, leads to a very distinctive shape, structure, and a form. You're a novelist, you're a poet, you're an essayist. Your second and third novels, fifth novels, are about the nature of listening. To quote from Afternoon Rag, the straight, angular notes of Western music, composed and then rendered, are like print upon a page. In contrast, the curving mends of the rag are like longhand writing upon the air. Each singer has his own impermanent longhand with its own arching, idiosyncratic beauties, its own repetitive serpentine letters. So he's also a musician. And the question I want to ask is how your love of music shapes your writing and your knowledge of music.
Okay. I mean, like Kunal said about not having a kind of adequate answer in relation to two languages.
Louder.
Yeah.
For the
Is that being mic'd as well? The thing.
Yeah,
outside?
I think so.
Okay.
But yeah,
I think when people pursue different languages, and music and writing are two different kind of practices, two different languages, it's difficult to connect the two kind of in a conscious way. The only kind of connection I would, well, there are a few connections. One is my love of form, kind of formal, the formal instinct. Music is formal. So you are sort
And
of,
Indian music is even more formal, and you know, so there's an opening and there's a crescendo,
and you're also inhabiting something for a period of time in which you're absorbed in, but not because that something actually represents something. You know, you're not being told about anything. You're only confronting form. And with writing too, for me, feeling the form. I mean, I think you can do it with poetry. So you have a sense of the ending. You have a sense of inhabiting something for a relatively short period of time. And during that period of time, you're transformed. With the novel, and you also have that sense of encountering form with the story. That you're inhabiting something again for a period of time in which a transformation takes place. It's kind of slightly misleading to think that what's happening in a story is only what's being told. It's also this changed kind of span, this transformed span of time which you're inhabiting for whatever reason that has an impact on you. Now, in that sense, the novel for me dangerously veers away from presenting itself to us as form. It pretends to present itself to us as life. So when we think of often we think about it in terms of the lives represented in it, or in terms of the society or world represented in it. And we don't necessarily, in the way we do with a poem, think about that the inhabiting of the form. To me, that formal kind of the interest in form, that is in a limited duration in which we inhabit a changed state, means that I'm drawn to the short novel. With the short novel, you are aware that it's about to end, that it's a brief period in your life. It's not life itself. It's something, again, that's an interruption. And this being drawn to interruptions means that I'm drawn to music, and I'm drawn to a particular kind of
so
novel.
are your interruptions like the silences in music, would you say?
Or they're like music itself. I mean, the silences in music are not clearly distinguishable from the music itself.
Exactly.
So that's one thing. The other thing is, because since you use the word listening, both as a musician and as a composer, and as a writer, I'm very, very interested in listening. So it's not just the image. The image, of course, interests me greatly, but also the soundtrack of what we hear. So basically, what I'm saying is, now, for me, for instance, the person who first discovered a way of representing the soundtrack of life in India, and again, when I say life in India, I feel very hesitant about it, about making that generalization. But it was Jean Renoir in a film called The River.
Exactly.
So now in The River, what's interesting is that you see a particular story based on a Rumor Gordon novel unfolding in front of you. But at the same time, the soundtrack always captures something that's happening somewhere else, which is not a part of the story. It's a different story, but it's kind of figuring in this story is peripheral. And yet it's a constant distraction, so you're always listening to another life. The other life is invisible. It will never form a part of the visible story. Satyajit Ray learns that from Renoir, whom he admires greatly. And his soundtracks are extraordinary for capturing not the kind of relevant sounds, but the irrelevant sounds, the inadvertent sounds, and showing us how within the frame there is a story being shown to us involving the characters, and there's another story happening in a different street which is invisible to us, but which is also always impacting on us. We are, especially in India, being constantly impacted, and sometimes over here, by the invisible. And this interests me both as a musician and as a writer.
So very beautiful, the image of the river and the sound of the river and the sound of those conversations. What I want to ask you is about the element of autobiography in your novel. There's a lot. I know everybody is wanting to go to the Shashi Tharoor session. We have time. Tell us about autobiography in the novel. Your novels, are they autobiography at some level?
No.
Because they figure a person who's pretty much like Amit Chaudhuri.
Yes. I have a double. I wrote about that a long time ago, my doppelganger. No, I think when you use the word autobiography, you sort of introduce into the conversation a genre where you're telling the story of a life from beginning to end, hopefully, with a clear narrative sort of intention, and you're also telling people about the important moments in your life. Now, in my case, I'm telling people about the unimportant moments in somebody's life. You know, I mean, these do not constitute autobiography, these moments. These constitute, again, interruptions. No serious memoirist would put in so many irrelevant, inconsequential moments in their autobiography. My autobiography, again, I mean, to write an autobiography, I'd have to start from zero and at where I am now.
No, the autobiographical element, because you come through in your books. There was a book by Stefan Zweig years ago called Adepts at Self-Portraiture. And I think in all your books, you are there somewhere.
I'm there, but
as a listener, as the man at the window.
Sure, but again, because I'm not actually telling you very much about myself, and my intention is not to speak about myself, but to speak about the fact that life is important, and life is important in its interruptions, that I'm not going to give you the important moments, I'm going to give you these moments which are for some reason important only within the framework of a novel. They cannot be important within the framework of autobiography or history. They can only be important within this rather strange domain, whether you call it poetry or creative writing or the novel, that these unimportant moments can have some kind of significance. That's what I'm trying to explore.
I think we have only about 8 minutes left. So I think we'll skip the reading and go to the questions. Are there any questions in the audience to this eminent panel? Yeah, please. She's getting a mic for you.
Just a very short question. Do you make the distinction between form and structure? Are they one and the same thing?
Somebody else also clearly had the same question. Yeah, next.
Do you want to take another question? Or,
okay, let's take the question there as well.
Just follow up, because since you spoke so much about sea and water, Catherine Mansfield said about the art of writing a short fiction as, I see a ship or a boat with lots of half-closed doors and windows. I want to know the lives being led inside. So it's the sense of detachment. And I think in many ways, Kunal Basu and Amit's works are almost the polar opposites, because with Amit, it's a re-engagement, I guess, with previous selves, which is not exactly yourself, but slightly maybe distant, whereas you, with your latest novel, it's something completely different. And my question is, do you get to learn or know something new when you are creating a work of novel, whether dipping back to your childhood?
So now we've got a question on form and structure being the same, and do you create something new? So let's pass the first question to anybody here. Is there a difference between form and structure? Tahmima, you look like you know the answer to that.
No, I think that
I'm happier with the second. I'm happy with the second one than the first.
I'll answer.
Okay, I think you answer that.
I'll answer, but Kunal, go for it.
I think writing a novel invariably changes the writer. I mean, it sounds platitudinous to say that, but it certainly happens with me. So Kolkata is the city that I was born and raised in. So I believe that I'm a thoroughbred Calcutta-wala. Okay? But writing of the novel not only changed my perceptions of the city, but changed my relationship with the city as well. Okay? So in the past, I would sort of claim ownership of the city.
That works beautifully.
Okay. But now I no longer claim ownership. I see myself as one of 18 million inhabitants of the city.
As a bystander.
Sorry?
As a bystander.
Almost as a bystander. Okay. And so I think it has had a profound influence in terms of how I view and how I see myself in relationship to the city that I grew up in.
He wants to answer the first question.
Can I just answer both your questions through smuggle in a tiny reading as an answer? It's just a
Very
few,
good.
Just a paragraph. And thank you for staying here and listening. Although the nation is going to be discussed, right, or empire or whatever. But
bigger things.
More important things are going to be discussed.
Not the humble novel.
Yeah, not literature. Anyway, so this is from a strange and sublime address. This was written when I was still writing the book. I'm not looking at my email over here. This is the LRB, the London Review of Books. This came out in 1988 when I was 26 years old. And I now see that there's a kind of manifesto over here in this section where I'm talking about a power cut. And this boy who is visiting from Bombay is going out with his uncle and his cousins on a walk through this city in which there are no lights. You know, so I'm going to just read out this paragraph, and the whole question to me is that has always been of interest is the purposelessness. What I'm quoting Kant, being learned again on aesthetics, but I think everybody gets that. You know, that the purposelessness of the aesthetic. Trying to understand what is the point of it. This is a question that always will be asked of people like me. But what was your point? So this is the paragraph. They've gone out for a walk. So they went out for a walk. They went through narrow, lightless lanes where houses that were silent but gave out smells of fish and boiled rice stood on either side of the road. You must forgive the writing is when I was 26 years old. There was not a single tree in sight, no breeze and no sound but the vaguely musical humming of mosquitoes. Once, an ancient taxi whizzed past, taking a shortcut through the lane into the main road, like a comic vintage car passing through a film set showing the 20s into the film set of the present, passing from black and white into color. But why did these houses, for instance, that one with the tall, ornate iron gates and a watchman dozing on a stool, which gave the impression that the family had valuables locked away inside, or that other one with the small porch and the painted door, which gave the impression that whenever there was a feast or a wedding, all the relatives would be invited, and there would be so many relatives that some of them, probably the young men and women, would be sitting bunched together on the cramped porch because there would be no more space inside, talking eloquently about something that didn't really require eloquence, laughing uproariously at a joke that wasn't really very funny, or this next house with an old man relaxing in his easy chair on the veranda, fanning himself with a local Sunday newspaper, or this small, shabby house with the girl Shondip glimpsed through a window, sitting in a bare, ill-furnished room, memorizing a text by candlelight, repeating suffixes and prefixes from a Bengali grammar over and over to herself. Why did these houses seem to suggest that an infinitely interesting story might be woven around them? And yet the story would never be a satisfying one because the writer, like Shondip, would be too caught up in jotting down the irrelevances and digressions that make up lives and the life of a city rather than a good story. Till the reader would shout, "Come to the point," and there would be no point, except the girl memorizing the rules of grammar, the old man in the easy chair fanning himself, and the house with the small empty porch which was crowded paradoxically with many memories and possibilities. The real story, with its beginning, middle, and conclusion, would never be told because it did not exist. So this is an answer.
Very beautiful. I think we need a clap for that. We have time for one or two more questions, I think. Do we have time? One question? Or we close? One question. If you don't, yeah?
I was just trying to understand what you said.
Can we give him a mic?
No, it's okay. Trying to understand what you said about the soundtrack in Ray's films. I mean, I saw Jalsa Ghar recently at the NFT, and were you saying that the music's about something?
No, Jalsa Ghar, even if I were to look at a film like Jalsa Ghar, I would not be talking about necessarily the music. I'm talking about the sounds. I'm talking what Ray is listening to. So on the frame, you have a story being told, you have the main character, but you also have irrelevances being introduced in terms of imagery, like let's say Charulata looking through the slatted windows at passers-by.
Absolutely.
But then at the same time, you have sounds coming in from elsewhere, which are not related to actually what's happening in front of you. Okay. There are sounds coming in from another street. And this is a constant in Ray. As it is in Jean Renoir's The River. Where the sounds are coming from, the sounds are very suggestive, but where the sounds are coming from, we will never know. This is true of most of his great films. So in the film, there are several stories being told. We are seeing one. Visually, it is a mix of the relevant and the irrelevant. But in terms of the oral kind of life of the film, there's always
the
stuff
musician
happening.
in him. See, the oral comes back.
Okay.
So on that note, I think we have to close because there are some impatient-looking, patient people around. Thank you very much for listening in to the structure of the novel.